Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So this episode I'm calling Elite Hard Climate Denial, a cross between oil industry disinformation and Hayekian economic cultism. So this is a further development of the last episode, and it's again a refinement or a take on the New Republic piece by Amy Westervelt and Jeff Dembicki about the Atlas Network and how the Atlas Network is an active political actor pushing for the criminalization of climate activism. In other words, radical climate activism, nonviolent radical climate activism, which, as I said in that episode, is one of the highest forms of civic engagement we have in our current societies. There are other ways in which one could be a model citizen, you could say, or a good citizen or a good participant in democracy and be an exemplary individual. There are other ways to do that, but one of the newer and more important, I think, ways to be such an individual and such also a part of a group, a movement, is to involve oneself in climate activism, in anywhere from letter writing, petitioning, going to demonstrations, to nonviolent civil disobedience of various kinds that push governments and also private sector institutions to isolate this fossil fuel industry, to cut off the fossil fuel industry, and to initiate a rapid transition off fossil fuels and also changes in our use of land, and our use of the oceans, of forests, so forth and so on. And all of these things are part of the umbrella of decisive climate action. So anyway, this network, this Atlas Network, is really, it's remarkable how concentrated, and I realize that this was sort of there in plain sight if one looked at other institutions that are part of this network, like the Competitive Enterprise Institute or the Heartland Institute. The degree to which that network is organized around fanatical neoliberalism or Hayekian, basically, which is partly the brainchild of Friedrich von Hayek and some other economic thinkers, and it is a development out of a stream of economic thought called Austrian economics, but that is closely affiliated with mainstream economics. It's kind of like the cult version of mainstream economics, and that is some of its power comes from that. I will do another episode that looks at that or conceptualizes that more specifically. But anyway, but what I'm trying to extract, and what I if you haven't yet read the New Republic piece, I encourage you to do so. And I will put another link to it in the description box here. But the degree to which, that there's also more widely established within the climate movement is the first item in my title, the oil industry disinformation and basically oil industry funding for, among others, these think tanks that are in this Atlas Network. Okay, so there's a collaboration between these economic theorists, so to speak, or cultists, what I'm calling, and the oil industry. So the extractive industries, mining, and gas and oil in particular, coal mining and maybe some other extractive industries, but in particular the fossil fuel industries, because ever since the discovery of and the wide publication of anthropogenic global warming in the last 50 years, that industry has realized that its business has a long or short time frame depending on how rapidly climate action is implemented and how effectively climate action is implemented by governments. So they understood more than the climate movement itself understood in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s, that government inevitably was going to be the fulcrum, the instrument by which climate action would be effectuated, and that our dependence on fossil fuels would be limited, would be reduced. And so they saw, before the climate movement saw it, or before much of the climate movement saw it, the climate movement has emerged from the environmental movement, from a bunch of different sources, and has been caught up in neoliberalism. It's partly a you could say stepchild of neoliberalism, or at least started out that way, and it's only recently, in the last 6 years or so, divorced itself from that lineage, so to speak, or from those ideas, that swamp of ideas. And so the idea in the initial versions of climate activism was that markets could be tweaked, okay, so that one could create a market mechanism that could be tweaked so that there would be sort of hints and adjustments made to the supposedly only market economy. In other words, there was a false model of the economy that comes from the Hayekians, or the Austrians, have a particularly ideological version of it, a particularly purified version of it, or at least many of them do. They're a diverse group, and there's some, alterations, and Hayek himself was quite a smart individual. He understood how to make his ideology appear to be more reasonable than it actually, in its implementation, has been. But anyway, it's a fanatical cult, and you could see a fanatical elite cult, and these cultists are criminalizing, the people who are doing the good work, or the righteous work of the civic, who are civically engaged as I'm calling them, model citizens, to warn governments and warn the public of what's coming by looking at science. In other words, using the Enlightenment, using their Enlightenment educations, using you could call them the remainders of the Enlightenment that exist it's still fairly strong in some ways or another, because industry and capitalism also has benefited from parts of the Enlightenment, and so there are parts of the ruling class that are more or less committed to various forms of Enlightenment, and many of the Hayekians consider themselves to be heirs to the Enlightenment, and they consider themselves to be the most sophisticated people on earth because of their ideology, among other things, and also that they're part of this, what they call liberalism, and their version of liberalism, and so forth and so on. So anyway, is liberalism without an effective state, and this is something that is being re-examined now among various people on the left and intellectuals about what is liberalism and so forth and so on. But leaving that aside for the time being, the climate movement is recognized, and we even have recent revelations that Exxon. It's not a surprise, but you have even more clear evidence that Exxon has misinformed the public, and other oil companies as well. And they had gained something of an advantage in the 1970s and 80s on climate research, understanding, as they were also science-based organizations at one point, or are in terms of geology and so forth, so on, and the geology that requires them to figure out how to extract oil and gas from the earth and send it around the world and sell it and so forth and so on. So, but they also gained an advantage over most governments in the 70s and 80s in terms of actually measuring, utilizing, in fact, also their oil tankers and their ocean-going assets, so to speak, to leverage, to use that to understand how the climate was changing even in the 70s and 80s. So, but they took a turn to then realize that if the word got out, and if governments became interested in actually doing something about this climate change, that their business would be affected. And so they started this massive misinformation and disinformation campaign, so which included funding some of these think tanks. Anyway, so the think tanks, and this is, again, it's hard for people in the climate movement to understand the connection with economic theory, because the climate movement's original DNA in terms of action was about tweaking markets and having a market, and also divestment. So divestment is still a private sector only affair. So you shame rich people, you shame rich institutions to not invest in fossil fuels and so forth and so on. So you're trying to isolate within the private sector the fossil fuel industry. So that's an appeal to the better angels of the private sector. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea. It's a good idea to do that. It's a good idea in part to establish climate action, and excluding the fossil fuel industry from respectable companies, so forth and so on, in the private sector is a good idea. So, but it isn't the cutting edge of actual climate action in the sense of government laws that subsidize, that either do subsidies, tax, but also create laws that prohibit certain activities or modify certain activities or create a certain schedule for extinguishing certain forms of infrastructure, like fossil fuel infrastructure, and implementing and changing that infrastructure so we no longer are dependent on fossil fuels. All of that has to run through government, and it's not something that is a voluntary thing, that a voluntary market or that people alone through their better angels, so to speak, will do. It needs to be mandated. And so and this is something that there are numbers of different political groups, not only within the elite, but among the elite, they are particularly concerned about it, and they also foresaw that there was a conflict, between real climate action and recognizing the extent of what climate change would be doing to the earth, and their own preferred form of power relationships, where they are undisturbed. They're in their search for higher returns from their capital, that they would be untrammeled by any government programs, by any massive initiative by governments, so that the preference among a certain group of those people, the fanatical ideologues, for Hayekian neoliberalism and neoliberalism, by the way, has been dominant. So I'm not saying this is a sort of a small cult. I mean, they're not, let's say a not powerful cult. It is a very powerful cult, and it has extended its influence through various dilutions of those ideas through what I call Economics 101, or I'm not the only one who calls it, but the establishment neoclassical economics also shares the same blind spots, or many of the same blind spots, as Hayekian. Hayek is the fanatical anti-Keynesianism, and in neoclassical you have sort of slight Keynesian ideas that are sort of conditionally added to the body of work, and then you only have then some heterodox schools like the MMT school, the one that I am closely affiliated with, which the modern monetary theory school that talks about how government is essentially built in to. I mean, there are other schools or other, let's say, thinkers who have put that in there before, but including Adam Smith among others. But anyway, the or parts of Adam Smith, okay. But anyway, the founder of modern economics. But anyway, that school puts as a fundamental part of the economy government as well as private sector markets, so forth, so on. So anyway, this Hayekian cult imagines, again, so, maybe you are familiar with various critiques of neoliberalism. I don't want to, go into great detail about them, but basically they imagine that the ideal form of human life is in markets. So basically bartering and trading and so forth and so on. And everybody is a utility maximizer that is trying to gain their advantage or disadvantage, or gain their advantage and reduce their disadvantages on markets. So through trading and so it's a very individualized and atomized world. And the idea of a government that is out there protecting a common good is anathema to it. And so they have been trying, and they have been, the reason why I'm emphasizing this so strongly is that they have been ahead of the climate movement, or they've been strategically ahead of the climate movement in trying to proscribe and prohibit and stigmatize a government-led approach to climate action. And so they have been in the ears of government leaders much more than the climate movement has been. They have been you see in the article, the New Republic article, how members of the Bundestag from the Libertarian Party in the Bundestag, the FDP, are at the forefront of trying to stigmatize and alienate make distant from the centers of power the climate activists who are in Germany, Aufstand letzte Generation, among others, who are those who should be consulted first, rather than this man in the FDP, in the sense of they have gotten themselves, they have through networks of power, networks of money, gotten themselves into positions where they can attempt to shape public opinion and to try to push out the people who are actually acting in the best interest of the public, and who are also demanding of government that the government act in best interest of the public. So anyway, this movement. So I think that I am helped in my critique. Maybe you don't consider it to be helpful what I'm saying, but I think I'm, let's say, sitting on the platform of, among others, modern monetary theory, to be able to say how wrong and how misguided and how cult-like the Hayekians are, even though they occupy positions of power and they wear robes of respectability relative to mine, but they are false, okay, in the sense that they are ideologues, and they are criminals in the climate, in the sense of, if you look at climate action as being a categorical imperative, they are at least villains, if not criminals. And it depends on how our laws progress in terms of whether we also actually have laws that prescribe, or that this level of certainly the climate movement should be suing as private entities these people who are calling them terrorists, among other things, who are attempting to stigmatize the actions of people acting as upright civilians. So at least in the form of a civil matter, they should be held liable for their actions. Okay. And maybe also, and that's probably the first step. Okay. That's a step before saying that they're actual criminals, but certainly they are villains, and that they are acting villainously and anti-democratically and anti-humanistically, anti-liberally. They think of themselves as liberals in the classical sense, or in the European sense of the word, and they consider themselves to be heirs to the Enlightenment. But anyway, they should be exposed in the fields of academia, in the public sphere, and also, I think, within the courts as well, as being a damaging, a sociopathic force. Okay, a force that is undermining society, undermining the prospects of society. So anyway, I maybe I haven't made exactly clear these two contributions, but let me just quickly summarize. So the fossil fuel industry has produced, as among other things, a source of money for these groups, but also has put out disinformation about climate and about climate change, and has, through a variety of routes, has created a climate of confusion about climate change. But then also there are these groups that are ideologically, their fanatical belief in a market economy, free market economy, and also anti-social democratic political views. In other words, the foundation of this Atlas network is founded on a revulsion of a rich guy at the seedlings, or the growing, let's say, of a social democratic system in Great Britain through the Attlee government after World War II. And so his fanaticism, stoked by his belief in Hayek's theories and so forth and so on, seeded this network. So, but anyway, these fanatics are not, they don't understand economics, they don't understand prosperity, they don't understand human survival, they don't understand science, they are anti-science, and they are anti-liberal. Okay, if that means anything to you, if that's something that you value, and they're anti-democratic and anti-economy in the sense of the real economy. So anyway, I just wanted to recast that previous episode, or highlight some parts of it, and also just call attention again to that very important piece in the New Republic by Westervelt and Dembicki. So please share your thoughts in the comments below, and please like this video if you found it interesting. Please subscribe to Politics 2100, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.